a lot of the sort of rites of passage that we associate, for example, university with, um, seem to be more about numbing feelings rather than encouraging them to develop. Yeah, who do you go to? What do you do? When do you pick up the prospectus and start reading and for instructions in there's not going to be instructions for that sort of stuff in the prospectus.
Mm. Right.
And so if those people then struggle, everybody moves on without you, and not in the sense that the other ones are much better developed.
Right.
They just think that they are, and the system agrees with them until eventually they get into a particular job and then they're 40, and that's why we have midlife crises.
On the first episode of Talking Rain, we went around and asked questions to teachers, psychologists, counselors, and administrators. We asked that, has psychological resilience decreased? And a vast majority of them had said that psychological resilience had decreased in adolescents and young adults. And so, we got curious, and we looked into the peer-reviewed literature to conclude, what are the causes of such a occurrence? And so, we pointed out three key major components of normalized habits that are highly promoted in our society today, in our global society today, which are the concepts of binge watching, the concepts of social comparison through social media, and the watching of pornographic videos, whether it be at an early age or whether it be due to long exposure. So first, we looked at why people binge watch. We found out the reason why people binge watch is the creation and the yearning for the formation of one-sided unconscious bonds between the viewers and the characters. It recreates a feeling of happiness. The people are using binge watching in these online platforms and these shows to create a sense of togetherness. Then we looked at why binge watching can be detrimental. You have a plateau where,
although you're clicking on the next episode out of habit, it's not making you happier. There's not that sense of heightening happiness. And eventually, you start feeling down, and you eventually stop watching. That happens because your body is now going from releasing dopamine to making dopamine so that it can release dopamine later on. So when we are going through the stage, we're in a temporary depletion of dopamine of sorts. And at that time, according to this peer-reviewed article that you can see right here, there's an upregulation of the renin-angiotensin system. The renin-angiotensin system is a system that is responsible for water retention, water excretion, and stress, the control of stress. And this is hyperactivated to compensate for the dopamine depletion. And so, at this time, when there's this hyperactive RAS system,
there is an exacerbation of oxidative stress, which means there's a heightening of oxidative stress. And at that time, there are some dopaminergic neuron losses. Secondly, we showed you through scientific literature how social comparison through social media has had a detrimental effect by causing increased anxiety, and how people's self-esteem had been decreased through social comparison through social media.
But in 2015, they conducted a survey study among young adults in the Netherlands and demonstrated that high-intensity Facebook use was associated with more social comparison. A similar relationship was also found in a study of Instagram, demonstrating that social media can predict individual differences in social comparison, orientation, and behavior. Another survey also showed that when people perceive their social media friends as having better lives, their reported self-esteem level was lower. Now, visual content creates higher impression formation by escalating social presence. And when social media promotes social comparison through trends, and that's in visual content like in Instagram or in YouTube, then you have higher impression of escalating social presence, which means that you're seeing someone that visually looks in a better social status than you. So it creates a divide in social status in your mind.
Social media users often compare themselves with others' appearance, ability, popularity, and social skills. And that is something that is an issue.
Because, as said in this 2018 article, such a comparison triggers strong psychological responses, particularly when others selectively present more positive information. In this one article here, their study found that lower self-esteem was associated with greater social anxiety, finding the echoes with prior research. And as one's self-esteem falls, the person's perceived inferiority may prompt negative navigation and interpretation of reactions from social networks. Such perceived disapproving responses would increase social anxiety. So what we understand here is that when it comes to social media, the key concept that is responsible for declining of psychological resilience is social comparison by causing social anxiety.
Continuing with that, we also showed you how children's fashion had been influenced by social comparison through social media trends, and how detrimental it was to the childhood, especially when it's key to the neurological development.
So why is it that children's fashion resembled that of the adults? It's quite simple, really. If you look into this article right here, written by Luna Journal, a famous fashion-based journal, H&M, one of the most famous mass clothing brand, has said that the millennial parents have a different demand. They make completely different demands on the baby and the children's clothing market today than the generations before them. Millennials are more trend conscious. And here we see that parents are making their children wear clothing that resemble adult clothing fashion because they want their children to look in social status higher than other children who are dressing up more children-like.
This is because children are societally, unspokenly defined to be a low social status, as they are defined by their mental inabilities, while adults are defined to be of a higher social status as they are defined by their increased mental capabilities.
Moving on, thirdly, we talked about pornography. We talked about its direct effects on the human mind, how it can cause anomalies in certain neural pathways. We talked about how long exposure can cause desensitization. We talked about how age is very important in the first exposure of pornography, because it can have an effect. We talked about how important it is. We talked about how early age exposure can be extremely detrimental to the neural development. The reason why we talked about these three normalized habits in our global society today is because all three of them are major additive anxiety sources. The reason why anxiety measures are very important, as we went on to say, is because the neural development in childhood, in adolescence, in young adults, from 8 to 25, anxiety measures are a key factor that can affect myelinization of neural pathways. So the people who had been exposed to the high intensity anxiety through their childhood, their adolescent lives, through their young adult lives, from 8 to 25, they had anomalies. They have anomalies in their brains, such as less myelinated connection between the neocortex, the cortex, and the amygdala of the brain, which means they have a decreased emotional regulation ability. Moreover, they have a hyperactive amygdala, which means they are highly reactive, they're more prone to be depressed, and most importantly, they're highly unmotivated. Even if they're interested in something, they're unmotivated. And so the episode ended with me identifying some of the most important questions that has to be asked to researchers. The reason why I made this episode is not because I want it to be educational. The reason why I made this episode is because I wanted to give an indirect message. But apparently most people that watched my video did not really understand the indirect message throughout. So, I will give it to you direct. If you look back at history, you'll understand that humanity began as gatherers. And then they developed tools, and then they became hunters. When they ran out of resources, they moved on from one place to another. It was not until farming came into place that they started living in places more permanently. Farming developed when people didn't have to worry about food, when they didn't have to worry about their hunger signals, because they could easily find the food to meet their hunger signals from their brain. It's only then that we were able to come up with farming. strategies and have permanent homes, better tools, scientific advances. One thing you get from that history is that when it comes to our brains, we only think using the neocortex, the decisive, the idea-making, the decision-making parts of our brain, when we don't have to worry about hunger, thirst, reproduction, survivability. And it's a well-established scientific fact that the lower structures of the brain evolved way before the neocortex did. As a matter of fact, not all animals have the neocortex, even today, which is why you'll see that most animals are focused on their food and reproduction. And so, through all the common habits that we have today, if we are promoting primal behaviors over thought, then we are making our next generations less thinking beings.
The regions of the brain that are used more are also more myelinated and thus easier to use.
They don't understand what happened, the changes that happen in their brain. What is going to happen to them in school?
The place you're in, and we're using the example of a university. The university is just going to leave you by the curb, because sure, they have a counseling service in place for you, and sure, they might have like a peer-to-peer network where you can go and share your stories, and sure, they might have like little, I don't know, trinkets of compliance, really, is what I call them. They're complying with the law and with the bare minimum. But other than that, they're going to put all the other people on a pedestal. They're going to leave you behind. They don't care about you because it's a numbers game. You hear universities are judged by what percentage of the students that graduate get into a job. Any job, doesn't matter if like that person is happy in their job, or if they're performing well, or if their job is commensurate with the level that they graduated at.
If you look at the educational system today, or at any time really, you'll understand that people teach you to write and read, but they don't tell you why. They tell you, learn science. They don't tell you why. They teach you math. They don't tell you why. They teach you history. They don't tell you why. In the educational system, we have been programming our children to only think and use your cognitive abilities to get a job, to fit in the society. It's not important what happens beyond that. Because to the system, it's all about that next test. And so, these students, they cram, they study, they learn, and the test is over, they forget. Once again, they get tested, they learn, they study, they cram, they put it on paper, they forget. When it comes to graduate schools and university degrees, as Stefan said, at a time when you need the most guidance, educational systems expect you to be prepared for it already. When all this time they have been preparing you not for new strategies, not to have new ideas, not to think about what you're doing, not to think about your emotions, not to learn how to regulate your emotions. They teach you how to fit in the system. They teach you how not to think, how to be one with the already popular thoughts and parrot their ideas. How do you expect global issues to be resolved?
It doesn't matter to the people that make the numbers, because if 94% of a graduating class is enrolled in some form of job in the workforce within 6 months of graduation, that is an unparalleled success, and we should all be clapping.